Hello everyone, this is James Shore with another how-to video. I'm recording this on November 11th, 2015. In the last episode, we modified our tabs application to, rather than hiding and showing our tabs directly, because remember what we're trying to do here is make just the one tab appear that we want to appear. What we did in the last episode is rather than setting the display property in the CSS directly, we modified our code, we refactored our code to instead work on classes, because we felt that this would better decouple our code, decouple our HTML and CSS from our JavaScript library. Now that code is something I'm not terribly thrilled with. This code is clunky, and we made several mistakes as we were implementing it, which, by the way, is why I use test-driven development, because I make mistakes all the time. And you saw that in the last episode. But with the test, we got through that. But I still feel like this code is clunky. Dealing with these classes is annoying. And at some point, we're going to want to remove these classes as well. And doing that's going to be difficult too. Fortunately, there is another option available to us. There is the class list property, which is available on Elements. You can find it by Googling class list and MDN. And this gives us the ability to add and remove and toggle classes on an element without setting the class property directly. So that's what the next refactoring I would like to do. I want to change this code to not use classes directly, but instead use the class list. And I think this is going to be pretty straightforward. I actually think we can get rid of all of this and instead just say element.classList, let's see, and that is a capital L, .add class name. I mean, you can see if this works, this is a huge improvement. Let's go ahead and give it a try. Our code was working a moment ago. Let's try this change and see if it works. Well, it sort of works. And this is why I didn't originally do this in the last episode, because I knew this issue would happen. You can see that it's passing on every browser except for IE9. And the reason for that is that class list, if we scroll down the documentation here, class list wasn't implemented in Internet Explorer until IE10. But we are supporting IE9 because, well, I like pain, I guess. No, because at the time of this recording, IE9 is still used by enough people to be worth trying to make our software work on. So what do we do about this kind of situation? Well, this is where the idea of a shim comes in, or you may have also heard them called polyfills. Mozilla is very good about this sort of thing. They have software here that will implement this class list function for us so that it works even on other browsers. So what we need to do is take this code, copy it, and paste it into our own code. Now I'm going to do just some nasty stuff right now just to get our test passing, because remember, what we do when we're in the get to green bar state is we don't worry about code quality, we just worry about getting the code to pass. And then when we refactor, that is when we worry about code quality. So I'm going to just try pasting this in and see if it works. I don't know if it will or not. I am going to document this a little bit though. I'm going to say class list shim courtesy of MDN. Okay, let's see if that works. Well, it's got all kinds of linting errors, so that's an issue. Before we try to fix those linting errors, let's just run the tests. Okay, so that does fix the problem. That's excellent. I'm going to go ahead and check that in. So we have modified tabs library to use class list rather than setting class attribute. Or rather, let's just say use class list rather than setting class attribute. Okay, now we need to get this to work. There's a couple of ways we can do this. Now, what's happening here in this classless shim? And the reason I'm bringing this up is because using shims is a really common technique for dealing with cross-browser issues. The way this works is it checks to see if the class list is already there, if that property already exists. And then if it doesn't, it goes ahead and adds this other stuff. Now, we could do it in several different ways. One, we could just have the function in here like we do right now. Another approach would be to add it to our vendor directory, and that's where I'm kind of leaning right now. And a third approach, which I've done on some projects, is to not, what this does is this actually adds the missing class list property, but instead you could also just call a function that does what class list does without implementing class list itself. And often I will do that, especially in a library, because I don't want my code to change other people's code. By calling shim, we've now changed the global state of the system to always have class list. And if somebody else has written a library that depends on class list not being there on IE9, that could break their code. However, in this case where we're just making a simple tab application for our own use, I don't think that's something that we need to worry about. I think the simplest way to do this would be to just run the shim in all cases and go ahead and implement class list for everybody. Because we're having these lint issues and because I don't want to fix them all, and I also don't want all this mess of code in ours, I think what I'm going to do is implement this as the classlist.js file in our vendor directory, because our vendor directory is excluded from being linted. Let's go ahead and try that. Let's go ahead and make classlist.js, and we'll just move our shim function into there. Like that. And we'll need to export this. So we'll say module, say exports.shim equals function shim. So what this is going to do, and I'll take off my copyright because it's not copyrighted by me. So now I should be able to delete this shim out of here. And take it out of here and instead say var class list equals require vendor classlist.js and then classlist.shim. And that hopefully will still work. Well, it didn't work. It's saying it can't find the module. And that is probably because we don't have it included in our Karma configuration. If we look here, yeah, it's not in here. And you know, previously I said that I didn't want to load all vendor files in our Karma config. I'm starting to question whether or not that was a good idea because this error was a little annoying. But I'm going to go ahead and do it manually anyway. That is, I'm going to go ahead and continue to specify them one at a time. It might be better to just load all vendor files indiscriminately, especially nowadays since most vendor files are CommonJS modules. Anyway, to make that work, I'm going to have to reload Karma. There we go. And now if I run it, there it works. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and amend our previous commit because all we've done here is really the same thing again. We're using class list rather than setting the class attribute, and except now we've got it passing lint. Okay, so that was another refactoring. I think it's a nice refactoring too. We've definitely improved the quality of this code substantially. Let me go ahead and amend the commit again, taking out those comments. Now doing the shim this way, it's a little awkward and odd, but I think it's okay. And that's all the refactorings I see in this file. Let's go ahead and look at our tabs test and see if we see any refactorings here. Well, as I look at these two functions, I see a lot of duplication between them, and that kind of concerns me. I'd like to figure out a way to fix that, but it's not obvious to me how to do that. The other thing I see in here is that this get class, we might be better off using a function in the class list property called contains. Instead of saying, does the class class attribute exactly match this thing, we might be able to say element.classlist.contains new class. I'm not sure if that's the right answer though. And this is the way test-driven development works. As you do test-driven development, it causes you, if you're doing it well, to really focus in detail about what code you're writing and how it's designed. And as you do that, you will sometimes get to the point where you say, I don't like the way this looks, but I don't know how to make it better. And in those cases, I will just add a note to my to-do. I'll say, use class list instead of get attribute class in tabs test with a question mark. That's something for us to come back to and think about. Another thing is eliminate the duplication in the tabs test class test. How can we do these things? It's not obvious to me yet because even though I have a lot of experience doing this kind of work, I look at this code and I say, I'm not sure how to make this better. But I do have faith, I do trust that as I continue to work with this code, as more code gets written, the ideas will come to me. Martin Fowler, I believe, had the saying, 3 strikes and you refactor. The first time you write some code, you just write it. The second time you write the same code, you look at the duplication and you say, I don't like that duplication. But often it's not until the third, or sometimes for me, even the fourth time you duplicate it, that you see the opportunities to refactor. So 3 strikes and you refactor is the saying, and that's something that I follow myself. There is one bit of duplication here, though, that I do know how to fix, and that's this remove element. What's happening here is remove element is removing the element that we've added. There's a problem here, though, which is that if this assertion fails, it throws an exception, which means this remove element will not be called. So I'd like the remove element to happen regardless of whether or not the test fails, because if the element isn't removed, it could cause a future test to fail for no good reason, and we don't want that. So what we really need is we need some sort of cleanup function to run after every test. And Mocha has that built in. It has a before each and an after each function that it will run before and after every test. There's also a before and after, which will run before all your tests and once after all your tests. But those are less common and less useful. So if I run this, you'll see that we should see before and after come out twice for each of our browsers. And yeah, you can see that here. We have Chrome Mobile saying, well, before is up here, and then after, and then before, and then after. So we can have our remove element happen in the after each. But in order to do that, we're going to have we have to know which element to remove. So what I'm going to do, something that I often do in my DOM tests, I'll set up a container that I'll create in our before each. We'll add that element and append it to the document body. And then in the after each, we'll go ahead and remove it. And that should work just fine. But it doesn't really get us anywhere. Because, of course, our other elements here, our div here, is also being put on the document body, and we're still not removing it. But if we put all of our test elements inside this container, then when we remove the container, all the elements inside the container will automatically be removed as well. So that's what I'm thinking I want to do next. I think one way to do that would be to just actually do the add element like this, and then modify So our before each will create the element at the document level, and then our add element, rather than appending to the document, will actually append to the container, like that. And let's see, it's showing an error on line 13 because I did a poor cut and paste job there. I need to say div here and container here. And now it's failing. It says cannot read property parent node of undefined, which is on line 53 of tabs test. So let's go down to line 53. And it said parent node was undefined. So that means element was undefined. And that's being called from line 18 of tabs test, which is here. So container must be undefined. Okay, I see the issue. Do you see it? This is kind of a tricky one. When we say var container, this is initialized with a value of undefined. Normally we'd overwrite that value here. But we said var container here, which made a new container variable, which then immediately got thrown away as soon as this before each exited. So the mistake was that I aliased that variable. I used the same name again as a different variable, which is kind of an obscure little issue. But when you see this kind of undefined issue, that will sometimes be the cause of it. All right, let's see if I got it working this time. Okay, I do. So again, what's happening here is before every test, we create a container that's a div, and we append that to the body. Then in our tests, we add, when we call add element, that is being put into the container. And then all of our stuff happens. And then at the end, we call remove element on the container, which causes the container and any test element we put inside of it to be erased. So I should now be able to get rid of this remove element and this remove element. And in fact, well, I was going to say we could get rid of this function entirely because we only use it here, but I think it's actually a good function to have, so I'm going to keep it. So now that I've taken out those other removes, this should still work. And it does. And let's go ahead and look in the debugger. And see how this works. So again, I'll bring up our debugger by going to Tools, Web Developer, Debugger. And I'll put a breakpoint right here. And then I'll reload. And at this point, if we look in our inspector, we shouldn't see any of our test divs. And in fact, we don't. So I'll go back through and I will skip over the create element and skip over appending it to the container. And now if we look here, we should see that div. And yes, there it is. And now we'll go ahead and set a breakpoint on our first test here and have it continue running. Actually, it looks like it didn't go through. So let me reload. I think when I said jump over this method, it actually finished everything out because I didn't have another breakpoint. Let me go ahead and tell it to keep going. No, that's not working either. Well, tell you what, let's just do this. We'll take this breakpoint out and reload again. So at this point at the beginning of our test, we should have, again, we have our container div. There it is. And then we run our test. We add an element which should go inside of our container div. And in fact, it does. You can see it right there. Then we initialize it, which should cause it to have the sum class option, or property, which it does. And then at the end, after we're done with everything else, we should call remove element, which will remove this div, which should also remove our test div as well. Let's go ahead and see that work. We'll step over this, and that has now removed our div. Perfect. Okay, I'm going to close the debugger. All right, well, that's an improvement. It's not perfect yet. I'm still not liking the duplication in here, but there's two important refactorings, I think. One, using class lists, which really managed to improve our code for tabs.js. And two, using container, which simplifies our cleanup for each of our tests. You'll notice that we're doing a lot of refactoring at this stage, and I find that that is pretty common in the early days of a project. As I first get started on some code or a library, I'll really think about it and do a lot of refactoring as I figure it out. And then things will sort of go smoothly for a little while until I build up a new body of ideas, and then I'll do a lot of refactoring on them. Next time, we're going to continue on with our next to-do idea, maybe hiding the inactive content div, or maybe hiding a bunch of divs. I don't know. We'll work on that next time. Your exercise for this episode is to go ahead and repeat the refactorings we've done so far. Go ahead and implement that class list shim and use class list rather than setting the class property, the class attribute directly. If you're not using IE9, if none of the browsers you're testing against have problems with class list, you don't have to implement the shim. And then in addition to doing the class list approach, also implement this container idea to have your tests automatically clean up after themselves. This is something that I do in pretty much every DOM test. I find it very valuable, so it's a useful pattern for you to get to know and use. For those of you doing the challenge exercises, your challenge is to go ahead and take the next small step. Go ahead and go through that TDD loop again. Figure out what small thing you want to do to move the code forward, and then go ahead and do it. That's what we're going to do next time. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you next time.